the heart of Savannah was its harbor. In the 1850s and up to 1861, the beginning of the war, there would have been in Savannah on any given day 50 to 70 ships, docked sometimes 2 and 3 deep, in unloading goods from around the world. Anything that was made, anything that was produced in the Western Hemisphere was available here. In return, the railroads reached out into the hinterland and brought in cotton. Rice and lumber were also important exports, but cotton was the key. It created a wealth creation machine that brought goods in, that shipped cotton abroad. The South accounted for 2/3 of America's exports at the time. The bulk of its revenue from tariffs and customs. It was booming. The town was awash in cotton money. That's what enabled them to make these incredible investments over a short period of time in infrastructure and schools and hospitals and railroads. So the harbor, when it was closed at the beginning of the war, really represented the shutting down of one of the most incredible wealth creation machines America has ever seen. And to some extent, it was a self-inflicted wound, to the degree that it was Savannahans who picked up all the big stones that you see, the ballast stones, and put them into cribs and put them out here to block the harbor to keep the Federal Navy from coming up the harbor. The other thing to remember about this is that the harbor on the landward side, with all of its warehouses, is almost entirely intact. When we take pictures from the other side, looking back, all we have to do is Photoshop out a handful of modern buildings, and you can see that the old antebellum harbor is still intact. Behind me was the yards of Henry Willink, one of 3 major shipbuilders in Savannah during the war. His yards were just beyond here, and he launched the Milledgeville, the CSS, the ironclad CSS Georgia, the ironclad CSS Savannah. The CSS Atlanta was built just behind us here at the Tifton Brothers yards here. So this was a major shipbuilding area for the Confederacy, one of the most important, and they were working day and night throughout the war launching these new ships. And you can imagine the challenge, because in the case of ironclads, it represented a whole new technology. And so there was a steep learning curve and tremendous pressure to get these ships built. This was a very busy place in the 1850s and 60s. During the war, the nature of activity changed down here because the cotton warehouses were full, but there was no capacity to ship it abroad. And the activities that were happening tended to be focused around military shipbuilding.
What happened to the city and its supplies and sort of the life of the city once the blockade went into effect?
Once the blockade went into effect, the commercial activities in Savannah began to wind down pretty fast. People who weren't involved directly in military contracts found, there wasn't goods coming in to sell, there wasn't money to buy them with. The blockade on a whole, by late '64, was actually it was still pretty porous in terms of getting military goods in. Not so much to Savannah, but to Charleston and Wilmington. There was actually a lot of stuff coming in, but it was not stuff that people, ordinary citizens, could use. It was coming in, it was boots, it was medicines, it was rifles, it was cannons and munitions. And so the city's commercial activity, which had been unbelievably robust, in fact began to wind down fairly dramatically during the war. And then, of course, we have Confederate monetary policy, which is inflationary. And as a result, people are finding that they need more and more money to buy less and less goods, and inflation always has a tremendously pernicious impact on the economy in which it's hosted, and it makes commerce that much more difficult. Again, in the end, the very end, barter was almost the only way to get, if you wanted to get something of intrinsic value like food.
Well, behind you now, Savannah still has a fairly active port?
Savannah is one of the busiest ports today on the East Coast. It remains a very important seaport. If you sat on one of these balconies and had yourself a glass of Chardonnay and would stay here for a couple hours, you would see ships, major ships from around the world coming in and out here every day.